With a fidelity and depth of field that are almost Baroque, Louis Lozowick's Storm Clouds Above Manhattan depicts a largely imagined New York City skyline beneath a sublime mass of churning skybound energy. The image, a lithograph of modest size, was produced by the artist in 1935 at the height of the Great Depression in the United States. It contains, we will likely note, no human figures. In fact, the city's ability to sustain life, it seems, is questionable at best. The buildings are illuminated inconsistently, and the uncertain source of light fluoresces certain buildings with an almost preternatural glow, while it leaves others in complete shadow. Lozowick would, 3 years later, recycle significant aspects of Storm Clouds Above Manhattan into another lithograph through Brooklyn Bridge cables. Lozowick preserves the main urban focus, but returns to this image a human presence. Note the group of three steam-powered vessels in the lower register whose billowing smokestacks intimate human occupancy, as well as the group of three men at the top right of the image, diligently occupied by the work of repairing the bridge itself. The curiousness of Brooklyn Bridge comes, I want to say, from the combination of the resolute naturalism of the skyline and human figures with the modernistic spatial device of the grid. Rather than allowing a straightforward vantage onto the city, the supporting bridge cables form a sort of screen against any passive reading of represented space. As an aesthetic device, the cables reveal the contrivance of Lozowick's representation of the city. Far then from being rote, unthinking illustrations of New York as it actually was, through Brooklyn Bridge cables and Storm Clouds Above Manhattan are replete with aesthetic choice and intention. What is more, the lithograph's desired political efficacy depends upon an aesthetic distance from their metropolitan object. Despite their clear significance, these images have received virtually no coverage in the extant literature concerning Lozowick. This would be much less noteworthy if the primary objective of the relevant scholarship were not, by and large, to assess the artist's handling of urban form as products of his dynamic and, at least among the American left, his shrewd politics. By locating Storm Clouds Above Manhattan and through Brooklyn Bridge cables within the broader history of Lozowick's cityscapes, this talk seeks a fuller understanding of Lozowick's oeuvre through a closer examination of the nuances of the artist's political vision throughout the Great Depression. Lozowick's cityscapes of the 1930s point to a leftist American art which sought something more than a bland proletarianism and which aligned itself more than has yet been acknowledged to socialist realism. Storm Clouds Above Manhattan and through Brooklyn Bridge cables were not Lozowick's earliest cityscapes. Indeed, Lozowick first found artistic success in the early 1920s with images of American skylines. These works were exhibited abroad in Berlin's Galeria Alfred Heller in the early fall of 1923. Images like Pittsburgh, Seattle, and New York, created while the artist was traveling throughout Europe between 1921 and 1923, found a notable critical success, certainly for an artist who was perceived as American. The catalog for the exhibition at Alfred Heller explained that civilization of the moment devoted itself to technology and to a corollary materialism, which saw their fullest incarnation in the American city. Lozowick's prioritization of just this subject demonstrated that he was a, quote, searcher after contemporary reality, an artist intent on giving form to the heartbeat of the era. Notwithstanding his otherwise grand language, the author of the catalog, Fred Antoine Angermeyer, cautioned against an overly sentimental reading of Lozowick. The artist, Anger declared, is, quote, no dreamer, no romantic worshiper of the machine, nor a naturalistic copier. His art achieves, rather, the highest degree of efficiency through, quote, a minimum of means, clarity, order, and precision. Angermeyer placed Lozowick's value in the disclosure of the spirit of modernity as it then appeared. This is to say, Angermeyer identified in Lozowick's cityscapes no sustained critique of urban modernity or its attendant ideologies, but rather a strict economy of method well matched to a specific formal disposition. The works expressed less a dumb optimism about the city and its forms of life than they showed the city as a determining condition of modernity and thus an object for potential critique. This was an important criterion for why Lozowick achieved even a minimal visibility in Europe, unlike many of his compatriots, including those who were more renowned domestically, foremost among them Charles Demuth and Charles Schuyler. Indeed, I think it is remarkable that Angermeyer makes a specific note about Lozowick's precision. Together, Lozowick, Schuyler, and Demuth are now thought of as representatives of Precisionism, the American style defined by its strict delineations of form, sanitization of space, and urban industrial subject matter. And I show here Demas' My Egypt, the painting that is probably used most frequently to demonstrate the Precisionist style, as well as Schuyler's Upper Deck, the work which marked, in the artist's self-estimation, his maturation as a Precisionist. Because of time, my direct handling of Precisionism has to remain a brief digression. Suffice it to say, Angermeyer's evaluation of Lozowick, which I cited earlier, suggests why Precisionism would come to have no significant reception in Europe. Images like Seattle and New York observed the city from an obvious distance. My Egypt and Upper Deck appeared, by contrast, as more merely illustrative and celebratory of their subject. Content and form in Demas and Schuyler were much too close. If, in other words, Lozowick's appropriation of the signifiers of urban modernity was self-conscious, a kind of apperception, an apperceptive process, Demas and Schuyler were more unthinking, hypnotized by modernity's pristine surfaces. For his own part, Lozowick seems to have been enamored with Angermeyer's review of his work at Alfred Heller. Lozowick would, in the years after showing in Berlin, rework the critic's language into a sort of artistic manifesto. This text eventually saw publication in the catalog for Jane Heap's notorious Machine Age exposition of 1927 with the title The Americanization of Art. In this text, Lozowick explains, quote, "The dominant trend in America today is towards an industrialization and standardization which require precise adjustment of structure to function and which dictate an economic utilization of processes and materials, and thereby foster in man a spirit of objectivity, excluding all emotional aberration, and accustom his vision to shapes and colors not paralleled in nature." He might also have been copying sort of German diction there with how long that sentence is. He then makes this claim universal. The whole of mankind is vitally affected by industrial development. The true artist will objectify this dominant experience of our epoch in plastic terms that possess value for more than this epoch alone. Despite its brevity, Lozowick offers in The Americanization of Art a conclusive and aggrandizing word on his early cityscapes. Far from being emotional or fleeting views of the American scene, the early cityscapes looked at modern society objectively, that is, as a sort of fact. That this view of the artist's place in society offered little by way of political efficacy, that it effectively rendered art autonomous and isolated it from the world, seems to have become an increasingly apparent and troubling problem. As Lozowick tracked the ascent of socialist realism in the Soviet Union and the exigencies of the Great Depression greatly altered the horizon of political necessity and possibility in the United States, his style changed drastically. In brief, the central challenge of Lozowick's work at the tail end of the 20s and throughout the 1930s is how an increasingly insistent political viewpoint was meant to be expressed through a less than radical and indeed quite retardataire pictorial idiom. An image like Third Avenue from 1929 marks this transition. This is the Third Avenue on the left here. Consider Third Avenue alongside an earlier lithograph we've already seen, the eponymous New York from 1923. Third Avenue reverses the cubistic spatial construction, as well as the more generally modernist abstraction of form that characterized the earlier image. While we witness in the Metropolis from a similarly oblique vantage, an imposing skyline bears down on us from above in both images, we find ourselves on much firmer ground in Third Avenue. Furthermore, we comprehend more easily the interactions of represented form in the later image. In an unpublished typescript titled Art Today, which was coincident with the creation of Third Avenue, Lozowick stakes a claim to a very broad trajectory for modernist painting. He explains that beginning with the earliest Impressionists, art gradually, by slow stages, departed from the appearance of reality and plunged into forms of expression whose tendency was to deform, dissociate, and dissect natural objects until the morphological identity between the painting and the object was lost. In a more fragmentary part of the text, Lozowick declares that art's social relevance was abandoned by the futurists' memory images, by the expressionists' inner vision, by the cubists' synoptic views of reality, and finally by the constructivist combination of materials in real space. Virtually all historical avant-garde movements had, in discrete ways, succeeded in bringing art to a stage when, quote, to a quote stage when nature, even in distorted form, even as a point of departure, had disappeared completely. Art had become, regrettably, a combination of purely invented forms. This unpublished typescript, then, Art Today, can be read as an autocritique, for it inveighs against those shapes and colors not paralleled in nature for which Lozowick advocated in his earlier published text, The Americanization of Art. In opposition to a modernism of pure invention, Lozowick was theorizing a social art, what he called a social art, which would, in his own words, acknowledge that the conflict is not so much between art for art's sake and art for life's sake as it is between two views of art for art's sake. Lozowick continues, although art which concentrates on its own problems, shut off from the common problems of man, is likely to end in sterility, the social artist has to admit that art is its own justification. Social art would, in the final analysis, retain aesthetic value as it worked to shift art's focus from its own problems toward, quote, all the horror of the system under which we live. Lozowick's profound aesthetic backtracking, his reaction against so many historical avant-gardes and against his own earlier work, was precisely an attempt to augment his art's political credentials. Thus, Lozowick's transition away from formal experimentation toward a kind of realism has already been conceived in the extant literature as a consequence of his developing political perspective. This much is not entirely new. What has not yet been fully synthesized by the scholarship, in large part because its parameters remain hidden in unpublished documents, is the specific correspondence between Lozowick's thinking about political art in America and his unmistakable embrace of socialist realism. In dramatic opposition to the now pervasive opinion that it was effectively an artistic form of forced labor, Lozowick identified socialist realism as a powerfully flexible art which allowed artists to take an active role in the construction of society. One very important typescript from the early 1930s in this regard, probably from 1932 or 1933, titled "The Present Moment in Soviet Art," is worth citing at some length. Lozowick writes in this unpublished text, "The theoreticians of socialist realism carry on a fight on two fronts and against two enemies, formalism and naturalism. Formalism is art for its own sake, art for the sake of aesthetic, form divorced from reality. It is an escape from the world, from objective facts to subjective inventions. Naturalism, on the other hand, offers passive reflections of the surrounding world. It is an aimless collection of endless details, a mirroring. Socialist realism, unlike formalism, insists on the social obligations of the artist, and unlike naturalism, rejects passive reproduction or reflection, but insists on active participation." It was precisely this two-front battle Lozowick began to wage in works like Storm Clouds Above Manhattan. The anti-formalism of Storm Clouds is clear enough, and I won't spend too much time here other than to remark again that it completely abandons the modernistic qualities which marked the importance of an earlier work like New York. The slightly more fickle task is qualifying Storm Clouds' naturalism. For this, I turn to another, slightly later lithograph. Consider Storm Clouds alongside Conmar Products, Bayonne, New Jersey, from 1937. The later image, the product of a commission from Conmar Company, does nothing other than depict the firm's campus with the greatest possible fidelity. Note in particular Lozowick's attention to windows in the lithograph from 1937. We can assume that they are just as numerous in real life as they are in the image. This stands in stark contrast to the blank facades of the skyscrapers and Storm Clouds. The sort of specificity characterizing Conmar Products was exactly the type of mirroring, the aimless collection of detail that kept art from activating its social function. It was applicable to a simple corporate commission, but irrelevant and in fact detrimental to the creation of political art. As the 30s progressed, Lozowick continued to track closely and with excitement the development of socialist realism. In yet another unpublished typescript from around 1935, after the All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers established socialist realism as the official style of the Soviet Union, Lozowick articulated with even more confidence and specificity his understanding of the active role the style was coming to play in Soviet life. In the text, which is titled Soviet Art Today, Lozowick writes, "Socialist realism seeks to give a many-sided synthetic view of social reality in the process of creation. It seeks to give a rich characterization of the men creating it and the men being created by it. Since the dynamic process comprehends both triumphs and failures, socialist realism will take account of both from the standpoint of their ultimate social significance. The socialist realist is not a passive observer of the phenomena he depicts. He is an activist who depicts changing reality in a manner which makes his own work a factor toward further change." This passage, I think, is truly remarkable. Not only does it position the specific task of the socialist realist as contingent upon the historical circumstances of the Soviet Union, it also looks at socialist realism as a contributing factor in processes of Soviet subject formation. This is to say, instead of denigrating the style as a formulaic illustration of a fully formed communist identity, which it would undeniably turn into in the following decade, Lozowick identified in the socialist realism of the 30s a capacity to image the possibilities and contradictions of a Soviet subjectivity still in transition, one not yet fully formed. This more nuanced and open reading of socialist realism, one which cuts sharply against the grain of so much theorizing about the style as the aesthetic incarnation of Stalinism, has only just been elaborated, I want to note, in very recent scholarship by the art historian Christina Kerr in her work on the painter Alexander Deinica. Christina Kerr, professor at Northwestern in the United States. To be sure, Lozowick was not so naive as to see himself as some sort of American socialist realist. Both his political and aesthetic outlooks were somewhat less strict than giving himself over to a single style would allow. More importantly, though, Lozowick recognized that political reality in the United States made the simple transition of the self-same aesthetic project impossible. Socialist realism was dependent upon social revolution and the complete overhaul of economic and political conditions, none of which were close to actionable goals for the leftist circles in which Lozowick moved throughout the 1930s. Thus, rather than proselytizing for the wholesale importation of socialist realism, Lozowick appealed to the sort of pregnant observation practiced by the socialist realist in the Soviet Union. More specifically, if it was the work of the socialist realist to help construct a new world after the destruction of the old one, Lozowick's goal was to strike a similar balance between formalism and naturalism so as to demonstrate, in particular, the city's position as the foundation of American and thus capitalist society. Lozowick would say just as much in a published article called Art in the Service of the Proletariat. Here he writes, "The American worker inevitably lives and works with cities and machines, but instead of portraying the apocalyptic city of the German expressionist or the mad and inhuman city of the Italian futurists, the American revolutionary artist pictures it more as a prognostication than a fact. He departs from the realistic appearance and paints the city as a product of the rationalization and economy which must prove allies of the working class in the building of socialism." Lozowick's retreat from the modernist instability of his earlier cityscapes should not then be read as yet another moment in the still hegemonic narrative of the demise of avant-gardism and the ascent of vapid and transparent realisms in the 1930s. The split between modernism and realism, even in America, even in the 30s, is not so clear. Indeed, to picture the city as a prognostication rather than as a fact, Lozowick needed to create images that were not fully stable or legible. His work needed to tolerate a certain amount of ambiguity and possibility if they were to maintain a political function and relevance. First in storm clouds above Manhattan, and then with greater confidence in Through Brooklyn Bridge cables, Lozowick made the conscious decision to depart from formal experimentation of his earlier work, to redeploy his modernist training and sensibility toward the invention of a novel type of figuration, that split the difference between naturalism and formalism, which would then be able to embody the aspirations of a then nascent but ultimately ineffective revolutionary project. Thank you.